All right, guys, we're going to do a quick recap here of Chapter 27. Chapter 27 in your book is on page 509. That's environmental laws. So just to start off with basically for environmental laws, if they were to ask you who covers the state environmental laws versus who covers the federal, the state is covered by the DEP, the Department of Environmental Protection, and the federal is covered by the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency. So if they were to ask you who covers the state versus who covers the federal environmental laws, the state is the DEP, Department of Environmental Protection, and the federal is the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency. So as we turn the page here and go to page 510, 510 on the top left talks about the Private Well Testing Act. The Private Well Testing Act, and I stress the word private because this only applies to private drinking water wells. So it doesn't apply to all wells. So if you have a private well on your property, before your home is sold, that private well must be tested and results signed off by buyer and seller prior to closing. So with the Private Well Testing Act, what it states is that, again, if you have a private well on your property, that private well must be tested and results signed off by both the buyer and seller prior to closing. And again, it only applies to private wells. Towards the bottom right here of 510, talks about carbon monoxide. Actually, you know what? Bottom left here of 510 talks about underground storage tanks. So if you have an underground storage tank, that's something you do have to disclose to a buyer, whether it be decommissioned or not. Even if you have an old oil tank that hasn't been used in 20, 30 years and it's decommissioned, you have all the paperwork on file, you know it's not being used, you still have to disclose that to the buyer. And more than likely the buyer's going to find out about it when they have a tank sweep done anyway. But just in general, underground storage tanks, you do have to disclose those to a buyer. Top right here at 510 talks about asbestos. Now, a lot of misconceptions about this. People hear asbestos, they think it's got to be removed, the house needs to be condemned, it needs to be knocked down. None of that's the case. Asbestos actually, if it's found in a home, is not even required to be removed. So asbestos, if found in a home, is not required to be removed. You can just encapsulate it. You can leave it alone, leave it dormant. A lot of times in basements under old tiles, you have what we call asbestos. They call them asbestos tiles. They're not required to be removed. In fact, if you do remove them, that could be when it gets into the air and you can breathe it in because of what we call friable asbestos. But the thing that I would say to note for asbestos is that if found in a home, it's not required to be removed. Carbon monoxide we talked about in chapter 24, so if you need any details on carbon monoxide, go back to the chapter 24 video. Mainly to know about that, carbon monoxide detectors must be located on every level of the home and within 10 feet of all sleeping areas, all bedrooms. Then bottom left here of 511 talks about lead paint. The year that I would say to remember for lead paint is 1978. All homes that are built prior to 1978 must have a lead paint disclosure form. You as the homeowner, you're not required to test for lead paint. You're not required to remove lead paint if there's lead paint in the home. You are required to disclose to the purchaser whether or not you are aware of the presence of lead-based paint in the home though. So for lead paint, the year to really remember there is 1978. So all homes built prior to 1978 must have a lead paint disclosure form where the seller is disclosing whether or not they're aware of the presence of it in the home. Remember, you don't have to test for lead paint, you just have to disclose whether or not you know about it in the home. All right, so let's turn and go to page 513. 513 here talks about radon. Radon is a radioactive gas, and people hear that term, it sounds all intimidating, all freaky and whatnot, but really, one of the main things to know for radon is how it's measured and what the acceptable limit is on that. So on the right side of 513, you'll see bolded there the term picocuries. So radon is measured in picocuries. The maximum acceptable limit is up to 4 picocuries. So if they were to ask you, what is the maximum limit on picocuries that does not even require remediation, is 4 picocuries. So if the reading comes in below 4 PC, you're all good. Reading comes in at 4 PC or above, well, that requires remediation. So the maximum acceptable reading is 4 picocuries. And as we turn the page here, go to page 514. On the left side here, it talks about mold. So mold, where would you find mold? You'd find mold in damp, dark areas. Mold is found in damp, dark areas, and it spreads through what we call spores. So mold, if you find it in a home, it's not the hardest thing to remediate. Sometimes you have to have a company come in depending on how bad it is. Sometimes you can even just paint over it with like a certain paint called Kills. But mold is found in damp, dark areas, and it does spread through spores. So again, it could spread quickly if it's not, taken care of. And then on page 515, talks about CERCLA on the bottom left here, which is the Comprehensive Environmental Response and Liability Act. What this has to do with is if there's hazardous waste cleanups on your property, how do they ultimately determine how those will be cleaned up? So on the bottom left here, it talks about who could be found liable. So number one says the present owner or operator of the site. Even if I'm not the one who's responsible for that, they could perhaps place the blame on me. They could say, hey, listen, you can't prove it was anybody else. We're going to assume it's you. They can hold me liable as the present owner. Number two, the owner of the site at the time these substances were disposed of. If they can prove the previous owner, John Smith, was the owner when the substances were disposed of, he could be liable. Number three, a person who arranged for disposal or treatment at the site of these substances owned or possessed by that person. So if I arrange for one of my employees to take these substances and drop them illegally somewhere and contaminate that property, I could be found liable. And number four says any person who accepted hazardous substances for transport to the site if that person selected the site. Maybe I run a company that gets rid of hazardous waste, and my employees are supposed to bring it back to our facility and process it and get it done properly. But I decide one day as the employee, it's the summertime, I just did a pickup in Belmar, and the facility is up in Bergen County, but I'm planning on going down to Belmar for the weekend. So rather than drive back to the facility in Bergen County, I just drop it off in the bay in Belmar, and I get caught doing that. Well, I'd be liable in that case because I clearly picked that site and I illegally dropped it there. So my employer didn't tell me to do that, so I could be held liable in that circumstance. So those are some examples there. And let's say, for example, there is contamination on somebody's property. If there's contamination on somebody's property and they don't have the money to clean it up, or they're not willing to pay to clean it up, the government could step in and say, we're going to clean it up, fine. And they could initiate payment at a thing called the super fund. And the super fund is a fund that's in place to pay for hazardous waste cleanups. So if there ever is payment out of the super fund to pay for hazardous waste cleanup, they then place a super lien on your property. And that super lien takes precedence over all liens except for a property tax lien. So again, if there's ever payment out of the super fund, a super lien is placed on the property, and that super lien takes precedence over all liens except for a property tax lien. So the government will pay for the cleanup, but don't think you're getting away without you paying them back. You will eventually via the super lien. All right, so next here, actually one more thing I want to kind of point out there with the super fund is there's a way that you can prove yourself to be an innocent purchaser where therefore you won't incur any liability. So if I could prove that, listen, I didn't do this, and I'm an innocent purchaser, I had a phase 1 and a phase 2 study done. A phase 1 environmental study is the first step to prove yourself as an innocent purchaser. That's kind of doing some research, looking into the uses on the property previously, doing maybe a couple of tests here and there. That's phase 1. Phase 2 is where you really do an in-depth test, and that's pretty expensive to test out, the contamination levels and things of that sort. So if you wanted to prove yourself as an innocent purchaser, you'd have a phase 1 and a phase 2 study done. And then, on the next, few pages here, there's a lot of just, additional details that, talks about wetlands and things of that sort. So you could build property on wetlands, you can live on wetlands, but if you ever sell property that are located on wetlands, you would have to disclose to the purchaser the property is located on wetlands. Wetlands are not always flood zones. That's also important to keep in mind. Maybe not for the test, but, you could have property that is deemed wetland, but not necessarily a flood zone. So you see that sometimes too. So that pretty much covers our recap here for chapter 27 of just some of the main points that you guys should know for this chapter here. So as always, as I always say, if you guys have any questions, feel free to email me. My email is kylekovats@gmail.com. Thank you.